Hello, this is Julian with Coffee Reviews, and today we'll be reviewing the Pepe Hon Nebula Wash Processed Ecuador from Thankfully Coffee. And there's the bag right there. And Thankfully, based out of Auburn, Alabama, and they're a coffee roaster that's appeared on this channel on several occasions, including our first ever review of their coffee back in December of 2023, when we reviewed the Pepe Hon Tax Dater Wash Processed Ecuador. And as of this moment, that remains my favorite coffee that we had ever reviewed from Thankfully. So when I saw them release this coffee, it did catch my interest, including the fact that they did have an extra light profile of it as well. So it'll certainly be interesting to see how this coffee turned out, as this right here is day 50. And recipe we went with for this coffee was our standard recipe at a 16:1 water to coffee ratio, brewed at 96 degrees Celsius, about 205 degrees Fahrenheit. And I actually like this one best through the Chemex, which indicates a more medium grind roast profile for this coffee. So as I mentioned, this is an extra light offering for Thankfully, and I do find it kind of interesting because we are reviewing an extra light offering from September that is also a Pepe coffee, and you can certainly tell that September one is notably lighter than this coffee, though this one is the lightest coffee that we've ever had from this coffee roaster. I feel like with the term extra light out there, a lot of people perceive it to be a super or ultra light coffee. This one I can say is probably a bit more moderately light, as Thankfully in general has a little bit more of a spectrum to the way that they roast their coffee. So I feel like for them it's very light, but for most people they would say maybe more moderately light by most standards and metrics. With all that out of the way, let's go ahead and start discussing this coffee. Day 24, first impression, and that's something that I should mention because the recommended rest for this coffee was actually only 3 to 4 weeks relative to a lot of other coffee roasters who have extra light or ultra light offerings that they recommend significantly more rest time for. But it did translate into the cup itself, as we were really surprised how impressive it did turn out for a first try. It was very direct with the lovely intensity in terms of a sugary sweetness. The notes listed were very direct, as it's slightly Kenyan-like with plenty of brightness and citrus, also wildly sweet, so it was an excellent first impression. So for people that have a lot of familiarity with Pepe's Mejorado coffees, they usually do skew in several directions. You have this slight citric quality, which at times can be a little bit of like a tangerine aspect. Then you have this kind of herbal savoriness, which at times can be reminiscent of the hibiscus. And then you also have that kind of Kenyan-like feel, and it can be presented in terms of the brightness and also the red berries. But obviously the biggest and most distinct factor for me specifically has been that wild sugary sweetness that the coffees offer, and this one had all of those things right from the onset. So for that reason, it definitely left a lasting first impression where I said, well, this is very much a Pepe coffee, and it's very much intense in a lot of the Pepe coffee aspects to it. So we move on to day 27 as we opted for the Chemex, and the coffee is still primarily focused on the candied intensity, but it's overall a bit less intense this time around, still offering the contrasting sugariness and Kenyan-like traits with a notably high level of sweetness. But it is just slightly toned down relative to that first day. Still very nice, and I couldn't necessarily differentiate why it trended in that direction. But we move on to day 30 as we opted for the April brewer, and it's another nice day of this coffee, but there's a little less of the focus on the candied sweetness of it, with it offering a bit more of a Kenyan-like feel and a little less of the prominent classic Mejorado brown candy sweetness. And once again, still very Kenyan-like, but a little less so as well. So the overall intensity and the overall direction of this coffee just felt slightly toned down. And it was kind of interesting because I felt like that April brewer day was really going to tell me how this coffee would perform with some slightly lower extraction adjustments. And I make that a very important point because I've said in the past that when it comes to these Mejorado coffees, and probably most notably Pepe's Mejorado, I found the best success with some slightly lower extraction adjustments relative to what we usually do. So having this result wasn't necessarily ideal or in line with the expectations that I did have for it. So on day 33, we tried it, and we're going to see what would happen. So some slightly lower temperatures, and there were mixed results, as it still felt super nice by most standards, but not quite as impressive as the first day, leading me to believe that it has gone back in the direction that it initially started from. So, super sweet and Kenyan-like with a lovely abundance of the complementary berry brightness yet again. So a lot of the traits are presented yet again, but I would say that they're maybe not quite as prominent, pronounced, intense, and defined as the earlier days. Day 35. through the Chemex with the same adjustments and same issues as there just mixed results with the coffee continuing to perform very well. And I do want to highlight the fact that this coffee was still performing very well. It just set this bar and standards very high for itself with that first impression. And also the fact that it was a Pepe coffee, and Pepe coffees in general, the Mejorado coffees specifically, tend to be some of, if not my favorite coffees out there, right up there with washed Panamanian geishas. So bar is very high. And while it's still sweet and candied, it's just a little less so, a little less intense relative to that first try. Otherwise, it's been consistent with the rest of the aspects. So the entire theme and tone of this coffee has been extremely consistent. It's just been tricky trying to get it to that same level of intensity and sweetness right from that first try. And this is the point where I began to wonder whether or not the coffee had almost immediately dropped off from when we first opened it, because that first try was obviously the first time that we had opened this coffee, and that was the first brew we got of it, and for whatever reason we were struggling to replicate that same experience. So on day 38, we went back to the V60 with our standard recipe, and it does still have plenty of the candied sweet aspects to it, as it's closest to the first experience that it had been since that first try. Coffee is very well defined once again. Notes are pretty pronounced. Kenyan aspects a bit less intense this time around, as the coffee does remain very sweet. And truthfully, given the very intense and defined first experience of that coffee, I just wanted to continue scooting that direction. The Pepes we've had in the past haven't necessarily been so loud in all of those directions. Oftentimes they can be a little bit more on the kind of Kenyan tart bright side of things, or they can be much more on the sugary side of things. I can even think of perfect examples of each of those iterations of this coffee that we've had. So having them offer both of those qualities was a very nice way to start this coffee. Day 41, we went back to the Chemex with our standard recipe, and there was a slight resurgence to this coffee. So it seems to kind of go down a little bit, dip a little bit, but I think it's starting to go back up, as on this day 44 mark, it had much more of the descriptions, much more being consistent this time around, and much more being pronounced and intense this time around. So it's still remaining in line with the notes that they have listed on this coffee, but once again, what I continue to track and highlight is just the way that it's changing in terms of the intensity, because this coffee, once again, just very direct. Day 44, final notes that we do have, and this was another great day for this coffee, and I honestly felt like I found a sweet spot for it, as there's an excellent representation of what this coffee offers at its very best, an extremely high level of sweetness and intensity, and a strong candied sense. The complementary extras include that herbal red floral aspect, the sweeter citrus, and that very strong raw sugar aspect to it. All right, let's go ahead and put up the tasting wheel so you can see what we're getting. And we have one level 5, so let's go through that one. And that is, of course, the sweetness at a level 5. And for me, that is the trademark of the Pepe Mejorado coffee, most notably the Thai-oxidated wash. And I think this coffee is technically different from that one, but they are still, at the end of the day, wash-processed Mejorado coffees from Pepe. So you expect them to be ultra sweet, and that's the case with this one. Is this one easily the sweetest coffee that we have had from, thankfully? I would have to really maybe compare side by side the Thai-oxidated that we did have from, thankfully, all those years ago to see which one was sweeter. But from my memory, I feel like this one was more intense and sweet than that coffee. So it is there at the level 5, though you could justify anything higher than that, like a level 6 mark for it, because the sweetness was very pronounced. And even though it waned at times, I don't want to ever say that it actually went away from that level 5, because it was always the level 5, even when it was at its least sweet and intense. Handful of level 4s. We'll start with the cleanliness level 4, and just kind of thinking to myself, I think this tasting wheel is pretty similar to the first time we ever reviewed Pepe from Manhattan all those years ago, but cleanliness was one that I remember from that tasting wheel because it is a level 4. I don't think this coffee is actually capable of getting a level 5. It is just very clean, it's pretty well defined, but at the same time, I think it's slightly imperfect, as it's not ever going to offer just a very true sense to a lot of the aspects that are within it, and it's just the way that this coffee, I think, is meant to be. So level 4, very clean, and I was very appreciative of that, especially given that the definition of the profiles within this coffee were even more so than a lot of the other iterations of similar coffees, I should say, since I think this is technically the first Nebula wash we've ever had of this coffee. Finish, level 4, and I'm very happy with the finish, especially given that it did skew in that raw sugar candy sweet sense. The first time I ever had this coffee, I described it as essentially if you had dumped a bunch of sugar inside of a soda can, and at the very end of the soda you have all that sugar left over that's kind of soaked up that soda. That was the intense sweetness that I described it as, and that's what's kind of present here again, is that very strong sugary sweetness. So I do have to say it's much more candied, so a very candied red fruit as well to go with that Mejorado brown candy sweetness and just that raw sugar sweetness in general. Acidity, level 4. I don't think other iterations of this coffee have all scored at that level 4. I think this one was especially and uniquely bright because it did offer that Kenyan-like brightness to it. And I think a lot of that can be attributed to the fact that the red berries were much more strong and pronounced than a lot of other iterations of this coffee, or similar coffees, I should keep saying as well. So level 4 is where we opted to put that. Florality, level 4. The hibiscus, I think it's one of the notes they have listed on here. If it is, wouldn't surprise me. If it's not, then I mean, we still experience that notable abundance, but that's also been another one of the themes that we continue to experience from this coffee in general. So level 4 certainly justified very high marks in that sense. Berry fruit, level 4. The candied red berries of this one are very enjoyable, and it reminds me of some of the more enjoyable versions of Kenyan coffees that we do have when they do have that very sweet Kenyan aspect to them. So very happy with the berry fruit being there at the level 4, given that it's very well balanced by the sweetness being as high as it is. Citrus fruit, level 4. I think they probably have something like a tangerine note listed on here. I do recall some of the earlier Pepes having something like a tangerine or a sweeter citric notes to them, and that's another thing that we did experience. But given that this coffee was just so bright and tart to begin with, I don't think it's too surprising that the citrus also scored pretty high on this tasting wheel. Caramel, level 4, and that is that brown candy Mejorado sugary sweetness that first captivated my interest from Manhattan's version of it, but it continues to remain my favorite aspect of Mejorado coffees in general. And every time I experience it from a Pepe coffee in this much sweetness, abundance, and intensity, then it's very enjoyable. So level 4, where we opted to put that. Final thing worth discussing, body level 2. I always say that I think one of the sticking points for people when it comes to Mejorado coffees is they don't necessarily always have the most amount of texture and body to them. They usually finish at that level 2, level 3 range. And given that we opted for the Chemex with this one, which really seemed to accentuate the definition of the qualities in it, it's not surprising that it scored at a level 2, slightly lower body, lower texture to it in general, which can be a sticking point for people that really want that Kenyan-like feel to it with the sweetness of the Mejorado. But as I'm looking at this tasting wheel, I do think it is a pretty good representation of what I was getting from this coffee. All right, so my overall thoughts and impressions of this coffee. This one is now my new favorite coffee that we've ever had from Thankfully. I do have so many positive things to say about this one. This is one of my favorite Pepe coffees that we've also had in quite some time, as I think they did a very good job of balancing it out to the points that I was looking for, because it's one of the few versions I've ever had of this coffee that's done such a good job of representing the two, I would say, different sides of what this coffee can be. I mentioned earlier in this video that we've had some coffees that have been very Kenyan-like, where the Mejorados just turn out so Kenyan-like that it isn't necessarily to my own preferences. And we've had some coffees that have turned out very sugary, sweet, and intense, and those have been my favorite iterations of this coffee. But there's been very few that have been in between in the way that this coffee was, and I feel like I really appreciated this coffee for that specifically. And even though at times I've usually preferred the more sugary, sweet versions of it, I think having this one be a little bit more unique and stand out from either of those two definitely helped its case. So really positive experience from this coffee, and I imagine that this coffee review is probably going to be released in 2025. So as of 2025, it's one of my favorite coffees of the year, even though we purchased it, reviewed it, and had finalized the review back in 2024. So unfortunate. I think it might have, at the very least, would have made our honorable mentions list, but it would have been a very strong contender for the second Ecuadorian spot in our top 10 coffees of 2024 list. Type of person I would suggest this coffee to. I feel like if you're a fan of Pepe's coffees, and I think you really have to be a fan of Pepe's coffees, then this one's a very good fit for you. As I continue to say, it's one of the better versions, and we've reviewed so many Pepe coffees on this channel in general that saying it's one of our favorite versions of this coffee is really a testament to just how enjoyable this coffee was. So keep in mind the very strong sugary aspects of the Pepe coffees. That's the first place I want to start. Couple that with the very enjoyable brightness that is combined with that intense sweetness to it, so those Kenyan-like aspects. So think of that in a much more prominent sense. That's the best direction I can point somebody towards on this one, and also the best way I can leave this review. If you by chance had an opportunity to try this coffee, I'd love to know your thoughts and impressions of it as well. If you're enjoying the content, give this video a like, subscribe if you're not already subscribed. This right here has been a review of the Nebula Wash, Pepe Hon Nebula Wash Processed Ecuador from Thankfully Coffee. Thank you for watching.